Innovating Education Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.
All around the world, the economic downturn is having a big impact on education. Public spending is being slashed and schools have not been spared. Now, as students take to the streets, governments are struggling to maintain education as a basic right. We visit two countries that have been hit particularly hard, and we'll hear from an expert on what the future holds. In debt-ridden Greece, everyone knows about austerity, even the school kids. With a desperate lack of resources and funding in public schools, some students are turning to private tuition to make up for shortfalls in the state system. But it's putting even more financial pressure on their hard-pressed parents. Let's have a look.
In 1973, when the students from Athens Polytechnical School went on strike against the military regime, their slogan was bread, education and freedom. In response, the government sent tanks onto the campus. 38 years later, the slogan remains relevant. Education in Greece has become progressively underfunded, and most parents now pay for extra private schooling.
You see schools closing all the time, you see financial resources dwindling, you see your colleagues risk becoming unemployed.
Because books are no longer available, the students here work from single photocopied pages. The teacher pays for the photocopying out of her own wages.
With the current conditions in public education, even with the best teachers, students believe that they can't get into university unless they go to private evening schools starting during the summer holidays or even the year before.
These private evening schools cost around €4,000 a year, but they've become essential for filling in the holes left by the public education service so that students can prepare for university entrance exams properly.
I'd like to go to a military academy in the maritime section. My dream is to work connected to the sea, and I'd love to study this. And as well, going to the military academy guarantees a fixed salary. It's guaranteed work, and you don't have to worry during an economic crisis like today, whether or not you'll have a job tomorrow.
But the evening school solution just isn't possible for everyone.
Parents know they have to send their children to evening school because without it they'll get nowhere. They won't pass their exams to get into university without going to evening school. So they have to enroll their children. But they don't have the money to pay. They have so many expenses, loans, taxes, evening school, food for their children.
All across Greece, the future looks increasingly uncertain, especially for students.
The economic crisis is perhaps the biggest challenge facing educators today. Cost-cutting reforms are taking a heavy toll, and policymakers are having to take some tough decisions. So what will the long-term impact be? To find out more, we're joined by Professor Ellen Hazelcorn, head of the Higher Education Policy Research Unit at the Dublin Institute of Technology. Professor Hazelcorn, thank you for joining us. What is the effect of the global crisis on education, particularly higher education?
This is a really important issue that often gets lost in the whole issue around the effect of the economic crisis. At the system level, we see a lot of governments then in response to global competition, moving to restructure their higher education systems. There's a big emphasis on world-class universities as being a panacea for success in a global economy. And thirdly, I'd say on the institutional level, well, because of all these other issues, individual institutions, universities are having to restructure themselves or reshape themselves, look at their priorities, look at what they're funding, changing their curriculum, changing contracts, choice of subjects are shrinking, and this is having an impact clearly on students and a concern about quality.
Will the global crisis lead to major changes in the education system?
Yes, I think we are likely to see big changes happening in higher education. Some of them are going to be at the global level and some again at the national level. Internationally, the demand by the numbers of students internationally is now reaching almost close on 200 million students. And the numbers of students is putting a demand, putting increasing pressures. We'll see some universities becoming multinationals in the way in which we already see in many American universities with campuses in many parts of the world, including where you are in the Middle East. Governments are now making choices as to where are they going to put their money. And in some countries, you see a drive towards excellence initiatives, whether it's in China, in India, Malaysia, Germany, France. And that, it seems to me, will have implications as to an increasing divide, perhaps, in the way in two strands of higher education being provided.
Thank you, Professor Hazel Korn. Getting a good education in Chile is difficult and costly, particularly as public education is not entirely free. In recent weeks, we've seen students take to the streets demanding the right to free access to education. They say they'll keep up the protests until the government gives in. We talked to young people staging a sit-in in Valparaiso.
Since 1993, education in Chile has gradually been partially privatized. And now, parents have to pay education fees even at state schools. But now the government is under pressure to take over the funding of education so that it's free for everyone.
In Chile,
the state has turned a blind eye to educational standards, instead of establishing and maintaining high standards. I think it is the state's duty to educate its citizens, and especially its children. So I think the state should finance education.
Poor families here have great difficulty in paying school fees, even if they are only the equivalent of €12 a month.
We've already been running this demo for 5 months and they only threw us out once.
These secondary school pupils are not alone. All across the country, people are rallying behind them, demonstrating for free, high-quality state education.
The government is frightened of us because they fear that people will become aware of the situation, that we'll throw stones and things like that. And awareness is growing.
There have never been larger or more determined demonstrations about education in Santiago. Sometimes there are 100,000 people on the streets. Education is a right, they shout, but the government thinks it's a privilege.
So what more could governments do to ensure education rights during this economic crisis? Let us know what you think on our social media pages. And before we go, a word on our Teaching Chemistry edition. Viewers in Madagascar say the lack of laboratories is preventing students getting the most out of their science lessons. That's it for now. See you next week.
Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.